6 months had passed since the Battle of Korath Prime, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Velith Dominion, once the terror of the Outer Rim, had collapsed into chaos, and civil war. Human forces had pushed deep into their territory, systematically destroying every military installation and shipyard they encountered. The worlds that the Velith had conquered were liberated one by one, their populations freed from slavery, and their governments restored. Ambassador Yeon Sora stood once again in the High Council chamber of the Confederacy. But the atmosphere was nothing like it had been 6 months ago, or once the other species had looked at humanity with dismissal and condescension. Now they watched her with a mixture of profound respect and barely hidden fear. The final report from Dominion Space confirms that all organized Velith military resistance has ended. Sora announced to the Assembly, the remaining factions have agreed to a permanent peace treaty and will pay reparations to the species they victimized. A murmur of relief passed through the chamber, for the nightmare that had threatened their civilization was finally over. Elder Counselor Thaxis rose from his seat and walked toward the central podium, his movements slow and deliberate. The past 6 months had aged him visibly, not from physical hardship, but from the weight of understanding how wrong he had been about humanity. Ambassador Yeon, he said formally, on behalf of the Confederacy of United Species, I wish to express our eternal gratitude for humanity's intervention in our hour of greatest need. Sora nodded graciously at these words. The Confederacy welcomed humanity as members 30 years ago, and we do not forget those who offered us friendship when we were strangers to the stars. Friendship, Thaxis repeated softly, and there was something complicated in his voice. Yes, we offered friendship, but we also offered ignorance and dismissal, and I personally treated your species as beneath serious consideration. He paused and looked around at the other council members, many of whom lowered their eyes in shame. We called you soft and insignificant, and we assumed your small patrol fleet represented the full extent of your capabilities. And we never bothered to look deeper or ask questions. You saw what we wanted you to see. Sora replied without accusation. We designed it that way. But why? Asked Counselor Mithray of the Arellan. Why hide such strength from allies who meant you no harm? Sora considered the question for a long moment before answering. Do you know the history of humanity, Counselor? She asked. Not the sanitized version we shared when we joined the Confederacy, but the true history of our species. Mithray shook her head, and most of the other representatives did the same. For 10,000 years, humanity fought wars against itself, Sora said quietly. We killed each other by the billions over land and resources and beliefs, and sometimes for no reason at all beyond hatred and fear. She walked slowly around the podium, her eyes distant with the weight of remembered horrors. We developed weapons capable of destroying our entire planet, and twice we came within minutes of using them. And throughout all of this, we learned one lesson above all others. What lesson? Thaxis asked. That peace is fragile and trust is dangerous, and the only way to survive is to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. She stopped and faced the council directly. When we joined the Confederacy, we desperately wanted to believe that the galaxy was different, that we had finally found a community where we could let down our guard. But we could not take that chance. So you built your hidden fleet. Thaxis concluded. We built it and prayed we would never need it. And every human leader for 3 decades has carried the burden of that secret, knowing that we were preparing for betrayal while accepting friendship. The chamber fell silent as the representatives absorbed this explanation. Finally, Counselor Verith of the Sindari raised a delicate claw. Ambassador, I must ask a question that I believe many of us are wondering about. I hope you will forgive its directness. Please speak freely. Sora replied. Humanity now possesses the most powerful military force in the known galaxy. A force capable of conquering any species or alliance that might oppose you. Vareth paused, and his reptilian eyes met Sora's steadily. What will you do with that power now that the immediate threat has ended? The question hung in the air like a held breath, and every representative in the chamber leaned forward to hear the answer. Sora smiled, and it was the first genuine warmth she had shown since the crisis began. We will do what we have always wanted to do, she said simply. We will go home, and we will raise our families. And we will explore the wonders of the universe. And we will build things worth building, and we will live in peace. And your fleet? Thaxis pressed. Most of it will return to the Sol system and resume its hidden stations, ready if needed but invisible to the galaxy. And a single battle group will remain in Confederacy space as a visible reminder that humanity protects its friends. Murmurs of surprise and relief rippled through the chamber. You could rule the galaxy, Thaxis said quietly. No one could stop you. We do not want to rule anyone, Sora replied firmly. Empire is a poison that corrupts those who seek it. And we have learned that lesson many times throughout our history. She paused, and her expression hardened just slightly. But I will say this clearly so that there is no misunderstanding. And I want every species in this chamber to remember my words. The chamber went completely silent. Humanity desires only peace. But if anyone threatens what we love, if anyone attacks our friends or endangers the innocent, they will discover that humans are very good at war. She let those words sink in before continuing. We built our fleet out of fear, and we used it out of necessity, but we will maintain it out of love, because protecting others is the highest purpose that power can serve. 3 weeks later, Admiral Park Junho stood in a garden on Earth, surrounded by the green and growing things that his species had spent millennia learning to cultivate. Before him rose a memorial wall, carved from white marble and inscribed with the names of every human who had died in the campaign against the Veleth. 4,200 names covered the surface, each one representing a person who would never come home. Park placed his hand against the cool stone and spoke quietly, knowing that the dead could not hear him but needing to say the words anyway. We built the fleet hoping we would never use it. And using it meant that diplomacy failed, that deterrence failed, that all the peaceful options we wanted to work did not work. He traced the nearest name with his finger. A young ensign who had died in the first destroyer charge at Korath Prime. But you did not die for conquest or glory or revenge. And you died so that billions of innocent people could live. And that is the most noble cause that any soldier has ever served. Behind him, Captain Beak Jisu waited respectfully until her admiral finished his private moment. Sir, the last of the fleet elements have returned to their stations, and the galaxy has gone quiet. Park nodded and turned away from the memorial. Good. Then we have done what we set out to do. And now we wait and watch and pray that we never need to fight again. Do you think we will, sir? Jisu asked. Have to fight again? I mean, Park looked up at the blue sky of Earth. The same sky that his ancestors had watched for 10,000 years. Humanity has always faced enemies, from nature and from ourselves and now from the stars. And I suspect the pattern will continue long after you and I are gone. He began walking toward the garden exit, his aide falling into step beside him. But that is why we prepare, and that is why we train. And that is why we build ships and weapons and train warriors who hope they never need to kill. Far across the galaxy, on a world called Salaith that had been liberated from Veleth occupation, a young Rathani girl stood in a field with her mother and watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Mother, what is that light? She asked, pointing at a particularly bright star that seemed to move slowly across the heavens. That is a human ship. Her mother answered softly. Part of the fleet that protects us now. Are humans our guardians? Her mother considered the question carefully before answering. Humans are whatever they choose to be. And for now, they have chosen to be protectors. But I think the truth is more complicated than that. What do you mean? I mean that humans are afraid, her mother said. Afraid of losing the things they love. Afraid of being helpless when danger comes. Afraid of failing to protect the innocent. She knelt down and looked her daughter in the eyes. And that fear made them build the greatest fleet the galaxy has ever seen. Not because they wanted to conquer, but because they never wanted to feel helpless again. The young girl thought about this for a moment. Is being afraid a bad thing? Her mother smiled and hugged her close. Not if it makes you strong enough to protect others. And that is exactly what humanity has become, above them. The human ship continued its patrol, a silent guardian in the endless night, watching over a galaxy that had finally learned what humanity was truly capable of. And, in their hidden stations throughout the Sol system, 4,000 warships waited in the darkness, ready to wake at a moment's notice if the galaxy ever needed them again, ready to fight and die and kill, ready to do whatever was necessary to protect the people they loved, ready to be human. The 6 hours had passed like a lifetime for the representatives gathered in the Confederacy. High Council Chamber Elder Councilor Thaxis paced the floor with nervous energy, his forelegs clicking against the polished surface as he waited for the human ambassador to return around him. The other council members whispered among themselves, debating what meager contribution humanity might offer. Perhaps they will send 100 ships, suggested Councilor Varath of the Sindari, a reptilian species known for their cautious nature. That would double their risk but show good faith. 100 ships would be meaningless against the Velith Armada. Thaxis replied dismissively. The humans have nothing of value to offer this war, and I only granted their ambassador time out of diplomatic courtesy. The chamber doors slid open, and Ambassador Yeon Sora walked in with calm precision. Every eye in the room turned toward her, and the whispers died into silence as she approached the central podium. Ambassador Yeon, Thaxis said impatiently, your time has expired, and we must know what forces humanity will commit to our defense. Sora reached the podium and stood there for a moment, without speaking, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Elder Counselor, before I answer your question, I would like to direct the Council's attention to the tactical display. She gestured toward the massive holographic screen that dominated one wall of the chamber. The same screen that had shown the devastating losses of the Murak system. Thaxis frowned at this request but nodded his consent. Very well. Ambassador, show us whatever you wish. Sora entered a command code into her personal device, and the display shifted to show the space surrounding Nexus Station in real time for a moment. Nothing unusual appeared on the screen, just the scattered remnants of the Confederacy fleet and the usual traffic of civilian vessels. Then, the first contacts appeared. What are those? Asked Councilor Mithray of the Urellan. Her bioluminescent skin flickering with confusion. Small icons began populating the edge of the display, emerging from faster-than-light transit at the boundary of the system. 10 ships appeared, then 20, then 50, all of them moving in perfect formation toward the station. Destroyers and frigates of the United Earth Navy, Sora announced calmly. The advance element of our response to your request. Thaxis stared at the screen with growing surprise as the count continued to climb. 100 ships, then 200, more than humanity was supposed to possess in their entire fleet. Ambassador, our records indicate that humanity maintains only 200 patrol vessels, he said slowly. How can you be sending this many? Sora did not answer, and instead she simply pointed at the display as new contacts continued to emerge. Destroyers and frigates took up positions around the station in a defensive perimeter, their crews working with silent efficiency. Then came the cruisers, heavier vessels with thick armor and powerful weapons batteries. The Council watched in stunned silence as 300 cruisers joined the formation, each one larger and more formidable than anything in the Confederacy's remaining fleet. "This cannot be correct," whispered Counselor Varath. "Our intelligence services have monitored human space for decades, and we never detected any sign of such construction. Your intelligence services saw what we wanted them to see." Sora replied evenly. The next wave of arrivals drew gasps from across the chamber. Battleships emerged from transit. Massive vessels that dwarfed everything else on the display. Each one carried enough firepower to challenge a Velith warcruiser in single combat. And they arrived by the hundreds, 800 battleships, Sora announced as the count stabilized. Each one built in hidden facilities throughout our solar system over the past 3 decades. Elder Thaxis had stopped pacing, and his forelegs seemed to have lost their strength as he stared at the impossible sight before him. "Ambassador, this is not possible," he managed to say. "No species could hide such a military buildup from the Confederacy's observation network, and yet we did," Sora said simply. A new alarm sounded on the tactical display, indicating incoming contacts of unusual size. The council members leaned forward in their seats as new icons appeared. Icons so large that the display had to rescale itself to show them properly. "What are those vessels?" demanded Thaxis, his voice rising with something that might have been fear. "Those are Titan-class dreadnoughts," Sora answered. "The flagships of humanity's true military force." The first dreadnought emerged from transit, and several council members cried out in shock at its dimensions. The largest ship in the Confederacy fleet measured 800 meters from bow to stern. A vessel considered massive by galactic standards, the human dreadnought that now dominated the display was over 3 kilometers long. A mountain of metal and weapons that seemed to defy the laws of physics, and it was not alone. 11 more dreadnoughts followed, each one identical in terrible majesty, taking up positions at the center of the human formation like ancient gods of war. Awakening from slumber, the tactical display updated its final count as the last human vessels arrived and took their positions. Thaxis read the number aloud in a voice that trembled with disbelief. 4,700 warships. The chamber erupted in chaos as representatives shouted questions and demanded explanations. Some called their homeworlds to report what they were witnessing, while others simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process the impossible reality before them. Through it all, Ambassador Sora stood quietly at the podium with her hands still folded and her expression unchanged. When the noise finally subsided, a young Rethaniade near the back of the chamber raised her hand timidly. "Ambassador, I have a question that I think many of us are wondering about." Sora nodded for her to continue. "How did humanity build such a fleet without anyone knowing? And why did you hide it from your allies in the Confederacy?" The chamber fell completely silent as everyone waited for the answer. Sora took a deep breath and looked around at the assembled representatives, meeting their eyes one by one. "When humanity first made contact with alien life, we were overjoyed to discover that we were not alone in the universe. And we were grateful to join a community of peaceful species who had built something beautiful together." She paused, and her expression hardened slightly. "But we also remembered our own history. A history written in the blood of billions who died because they trusted in peace without preparing for war. And we remembered every empire that rose by promising protection and fell by providing none." Thaxis stepped forward with uncertainty in his movements. "But we are your allies," he protested. "Why would you hide such power from those who wished you only friendship?" "Because you never asked what we were afraid of," Sora replied softly. And the answer was everything. She let those words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Every species in this chamber evolved on a gentle world. A paradise compared to Earth, and you cannot imagine what it means to grow up on a planet that tries to kill you every single day." The tactical display flickered, and a new face appeared on the main screen. Admiral Park Junho looked out at the assembled council. with steady eyes that showed no surprise at their shock. "This is Fleet Admiral Park of the United Earth Navy," he announced. "I have been authorized by United Earth Command to provide full military intervention against the Velith Dominion." His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction as he addressed the terrified and amazed representatives. "My fleet is at your disposal, and my orders are simple: to find the enemy and destroy them completely." He leaned forward slightly, and his next words seemed to fill the entire chamber. "So I ask you, counselors, where is the enemy located? Because humanity has come to fight, and we will not stop until this threat is ended forever." In the stunned silence that followed, Daxus finally found his voice. "Admiral, I must ask, why did humanity prepare for war when we offered only peace?" Park smiled, and there was no joy in it at all. "Because, Elder Counselor, peace is what we wanted, but war is what we expected. And we have spent 10,000 years learning that expecting the worst is the only way to survive it." Warlord Sethix stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, and watched his armada take position around the planet Karth Prime. 800 warships formed the Wall of Death in orbit, each vessel crewed by warriors who had known nothing but victory for generations. The Velith Dominion had conquered 47 worlds in the past century, and not once had they faced a force capable of stopping their advance. "Warlord, our scouts report an enemy fleet approaching from the inner systems," announced his tactical officer. A scarred veteran named Crethan Sethix laughed at this news, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "The Confederacy sends their broken remnants against us," he said dismissively. "How many ships do they bring to their slaughter?" Crethan studied his sensor display and frowned. Initial readings indicate several hundred vessels. "Warlord, but the numbers seem to be increasing." "Increasing?" Sethix repeated with mild interest. "Perhaps they gathered more survivors than we expected." He walked to the main viewport and looked out at his magnificent fleet. The Velith were a predator species, evolved to hunt and kill on a world where only the strongest survived. And they had carried that philosophy into space with devastating success. The Confederacy soft species had never faced true predators before, and their defeat at Mirax had proven what Sethix always knew: that civilization made species weak. "Warlord, the sensor readings are still climbing," Crethan reported, his voice now carrying an edge of uncertainty. "We are detecting over 1,000 enemy contacts." Sethix turned sharply at this news. 1,000 ships? He demanded. "That is impossible, as we destroyed most of their fleet at Mirax." "These vessels do not match Confederacy signatures," Crethan replied, his claws flying over his console. "They appear to be of unknown origin, and their formation patterns are unlike anything in our databases." The main tactical display activated automatically, showing the approaching enemy force, and detail sticks watched as the icons multiplied across the screen, spreading like a disease through the space between his fleet and the approaching enemy. 2,000 contacts, Crethan announced. 2,500, 3,000. "How can this be?" Sethix snarled. "What species commands such a force?" His communications officer turned toward him with fear visible in her posture. "Warlord, we are receiving a transmission from the enemy fleet, and they identify themselves as the United Earth Navy. Humans?" Sethix hissed with disbelief. "The traders and explorers, the species we dismissed as beneath notice? The count has reached 4,000 vessels." "Warlord," Crethan reported, his voice now openly trembling, "and there are 12 massive contacts at the center of their formation, larger than any ship I have ever seen." The transmission came through before Sethix could respond, and the face of a human male appeared on his main screen. "I am Fleet Admiral Park Junho of the United Earth Navy," the human said calmly. "Your forces have attacked our allies and murdered innocent civilians, and I am here to deliver the consequences." Sethix gathered his composure and stepped forward to face the display. Human, I do not know how your insignificant species assembled this fleet, but numbers alone do not win battles. And my warriors have never been defeated. Admiral Park's expression did not change. There's a first time for everything. Warlord, and this is yours. The transmission ended, and the human fleet began to advance. What followed would be recorded in the histories of 100 species as the most devastating naval battle in galactic memory. The human destroyers struck first, racing ahead of the main fleet in tight squadrons that seemed to ignore all standard tactical doctrine, where Confederacy ships fought defensively and protected their formations. The human destroyers attacked with savage aggression, diving into the Velith lines without regard for their own safety. They are insane, Crethan shouted as human ships exploded around his fleet. They throw themselves at our guns like they want to die. But Sethix saw what his officer did not. That every suicidal charge had a purpose. The destroyers were targeting shield generators and sensor arrays, blinding and weakening the Velith ships even as they died. All vessels, concentrate fire on those destroyers. Sethix commanded. His fleet responded, pouring energy into the small human ships, but for every destroyer they destroyed, 3 more took its place. Then the carriers Araved Sithix had never seen anything like the swarms that poured from the human carrier ships. Thousands upon thousands of small fighters that moved like a single organism. The fighters overwhelmed his point defense systems through sheer numbers, slipping through gaps in his fire coverage and striking at vulnerable spots that his gunners could not protect. We are losing ships too quickly, Crethan reported desperately. 7 cruisers destroyed in the past 2 minutes. Fall back to defensive formation, Sethix ordered. We will let them break themselves against our combined firepower. His fleet pulled back and formed a tight wall around the flagship, presenting a unified barrier of weapons that should have been impenetrable. Then, the human dreadnoughts opened fire. Sethix felt his ship shudder as energy beams of impossible power struck his forward. Shields, the Eternal Conquest, was the most heavily armored ship in the Velith fleet, designed to withstand concentrated fire from an entire enemy squadron. And those shields failed in less than 30 seconds. How can their weapons be so powerful? He demanded as his bridge crew scrambled to reroute power. Unknown, Warlord, Crethan answered. Our analysis indicates their technology is at least 2 generations ahead of anything we have encountered. The battle raged for 11 hours. And with every hour, the Velith losses mounted human battleships pushed through the defensive formation with relentless pressure, their thick armor absorbing punishment that would have destroyed Confederacy vessels twice their size. Human fighters continued to swarm and harass, never allowing the Velith gunners a moment of peace, and always the dreadnoughts advanced. Unstoppable mountains of destruction that shattered everything in their path. Sethix watched his proud armada die around him. And for the first time in his life, he understood what prey felt when the hunter closed in. Warlord, we have lost 600 ships, Crethan reported, his voice now hollow with shock. The humans have lost perhaps 200. Signal a general retreat, Sethix ordered, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. All surviving vessels are to break off and flee to Dominion space. The retreat order went out, but the humans did not allow escape. Admiral Park's voice came over the open channel, broadcast to every Velith ship in the system. You are not retreating from this battle, he said coldly. Your fleet attacked peaceful worlds and murdered civilians, and the price for that crime is total destruction. Human ships moved to cut off every escape route, their formation shifting with inhuman precision to block the fleeing Velith. They are hunting us, Crethan whispered with horror. Yes, Sethix agreed. They are exactly what we thought they could never be. The final hours of the battle were not a fight, but a slaughter. Human ships chased down every Velith vessel that tried to run, Destroying them with methodical efficiency, Sethix watched from his crippled flagship as the last of his escort ships vanished in balls of flame. Only a handful of Velith vessels escaped, those fast enough to outrun the human pursuit. And they fled toward Dominion space, carrying tales of horror that would shake their civilization to its core. Sethix himself was not among the survivors, as his bridge collapsed around him. He recorded one final message to his people, a warning from a warrior who had finally met a species more dangerous than his own. "Do not wake the humans," he rasped as blood filled his lungs. "Do not provoke them, do not challenge them, and do not ever make them your enemy." He paused and coughed, his life fading quickly, for they are not the soft creatures we believed. And they are predators beyond anything we ever imagined. And they will hunt you to the end of the universe if you give them reason. The eternal conquest exploded seconds later, and Warlord Sethix joined the 800 ships he had led to their doom in the silence that followed. Admiral Park stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance and watched the debris field that had once been a Velith Armada admiral. His tactical officer reported, "All enemy vessels have been neutralized except for 7 that escaped to faster than light." Park nodded slowly. "Let them run and let them carry word of what happened here. For I want the Dominion to know exactly what is coming for them." He turned to his communications officer. "Signal the fleet to begin recovery operations and render aid to any enemy survivors. Because we are not butchers, and we will treat prisoners with dignity." The officer blinked in surprise at this order, but relayed it immediately. Park looked back at the debris field and spoke quietly to himself. "We built this fleet hoping we would never use it. And using it means we failed to prevent this war." He paused and straightened his shoulders. "But protecting the innocent is worth any cost, and this is only the beginning." Fleet Admiral Park, Junho, stood on the observation deck of Titan Station and watched the stars turn slowly beyond the reinforced windows behind him. Dozens of officers worked at their stations with quiet efficiency, processing the activation orders that would change everything the galaxy believed about humanity. "Admiral, all sector commanders have confirmed receipt of the deployment order," reported Captain Beek Jisoo, his chief of staff. "Full mobilization will be complete within 4 hours." "Good," Park replied without turning from the window. "And what is the status of the 1st through 10th battle groups?" "Already moving to their assembly points, sir. And the Dreadnought squadrons are powering up their primary drives as we speak." Park nodded and finally turned to face the command center that served as the nerve center of humanity's greatest secret. 30 years of preparation had led to this moment, and he felt the weight of that history pressing down on his shoulders when humanity first ventured beyond their solar system and encountered the Confederacy of United Species. Their leaders had faced a choice. They could relax into the safety of a galactic community that had maintained peace for thousands of years, or they could remember the lessons of their own bloody past. The leaders of that generation chose to remember on the surface. Humanity presented a friendly face to the galaxy. They established trade routes and cultural exchanges and sent curious scientists to study the wonders of alien civilizations. They maintained a modest defensive fleet of 200 patrol ships, just enough to protect their trade vessels and discourage pirates, but beneath that surface, hidden in the asteroid belts and hollowed moons and stations disguised as mining operations, humanity built something else entirely. Park walked to a holographic display and activated it with a gesture. The image showed the Sol system in exquisite detail, with Earth gleaming blue and green at its center. Then he entered his command codes, and the display transformed. Hidden icons appeared throughout the system, thousands of them clustered in locations that official maps showed as empty space or unremarkable rocks. "Show them what we have built." "Captain," Park Order Ejisu nodded and expanded the display to show the true scope of humanity's military power in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. 17 massive construction yards had operated in secret for 3 decades. They had produced over 2,000 warships of various classes, from nimble destroyers to heavily armored cruisers designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting around the moons of Saturn. Another cluster of facilities had focused on a different project. Here the carrier groups had been assembled. Vast ships capable of launching hundreds of fighters and bombers that could swarm enemy formations like angry insects. The fighters themselves were piloted by humans trained from childhood in the art of space combat. Warriors who lived for the moment they would finally prove their worth, but the true heart of humanity's hidden strength orbited in the darkness beyond Neptune, where the cold and the distance provided perfect cover for the most ambitious construction project in human history. Displayed the Titan-class dreadnoughts. Park commanded. The hologram shifted to show 12 enormous vessels, each one over 3 kilometers long and bristling with weapons that could crack a planet's crust. These were the flagships of humanity's secret fleet, built to be nearly indestructible and armed with technology that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. 12 dreadnoughts, Jizu said softly, the largest warships ever constructed by any known species, and each one is worth 100 of anything the Confederacy or the Velith have ever built, Park added. Our engineers studied every naval engagement in galactic history and designed these ships to counter every tactic our enemies might use. The display continued to expand, showing more and more hidden assets that the galaxy had never suspected. Stealth destroyers capable of approaching enemy vessels completely undetected before, striking with devastating force. Electronic warfare platforms that could blind and confuse opposing fleets, while human ships moved into position. Supply and repair vessels that could keep the fleet fighting indefinitely without returning to port and behind. All of this hardware stood the personnel who would operate it. Over 4 million trained naval officers and crew who had dedicated their lives to preparing for a war they hoped would never come. Park remembered his own early days in the service, when he had been a young ensign assigned to his first hidden construction yard. He had asked his commanding officer why humanity needed such a massive military. When the galaxy seemed so peaceful, the old admiral had looked at him with eyes that had seen too much history and answered with words Park had never forgotten. Peace is a gift that must be defended, and those who forget that lesson learn it again in blood. Now Park understood those words better than he ever wanted to. Admiral, we are receiving a communication from the Confederacy observation post near our border, an officer reported. They are detecting our fleet movements and requesting an explanation. Park smiled grimly at this news. Let them watch, and let them count what emerges from the dark across the Sol system. The hidden fleet began to move in the asteroid belt. Destroyer squadrons powered up their engines and formed into precise combat formations. The carriers released swarms of fighters for final equipment checks before the long journey ahead and in the frozen darkness beyond Neptune. The great dreadnoughts came alive for the first time since their construction. Admiral Park watched the reports flow in from every sector, each one confirming that another element of the fleet was ready for deployment. 4,700 warships in total, a force that dwarfed anything the galaxy had seen in living memory. Sir, the first fleet is ready to make the jump to Confederacy space, Jisu reported. Send them, and have the 2nd through 8th fleets follow at 10-minute intervals. For we want the Confederacy to understand exactly what is coming to help them. As the orders went out, Park thought about the billions of lives that depended on what happened next. The Confederacy had dismissed humanity as soft and insignificant, useful only for trade and cultural exchange. They had no idea that humans had evolved on one of the most dangerous planets in the known galaxy. A world of earthquakes and volcanoes and predators and diseases that killed. Without mercy, they had no idea that human history was written in blood and fire. That every generation had known war and every child learned stories of survival against impossible odds. And they had no idea that when humans loved something, they would burn the universe itself to protect it. Admiral, the observation post is transmitting an urgent alert to the Confederacy High Council, an officer announced. They are reporting massive fleet movements from human space. What do their sensors show? Park asked. The officer paused as she read the incoming data, and her voice shook slightly when she answered. They counted the first wave and stopped counting at 300 vessels, sir. And they are asking if their sensors are malfunctioning because they cannot believe the numbers. Tell them their sensors are working perfectly, and the numbers will keep climbing. Park turned back to the window and watched as the first dreadnought moved past Titan Station, its massive hull blocking out the stars as it accelerated toward the jump point. 30 years we have waited, he said quietly. 30 years we have built and trained and prayed we would never need to use what we created. Jesus stepped up beside him and watched the fleet deploy. Sir, do you think the Confederacy will understand what we have sacrificed to build this force? Park shook his head slowly. They will see the ships and the weapons and the soldiers, but they will not understand the fear that drove us to create them. For they have never known what it means to be alone in a hostile universe. And they have never had to fight for every breath against a world that wanted them dead. He paused and looked at his reflection in the dark window. But today they will learn that humanity's greatest strength is not our technology or our tactics. And it is the simple fact that we have always been afraid, and fear made us prepare for everything. The emergency alarm echoed through the corridors of Nexus Station, the great capital of the Confederacy of United Species. And Ambassador Yeon Sora looked up from her desk with immediate concern. She had served as humanity's representative to the galactic community for 7 years now, and she had never heard that particular alarm before her assistant, a young man named Kim Do-yeon, rushed into her office with panic written across his face. Ambassador, the High Council has called an emergency session, he said quickly. All species representatives must attend immediately. Sora rose from her chair and straightened her formal uniform, the deep blue fabric marked with the silver emblem of United Earth. What is the situation? She asked as they walked briskly toward the council chamber. The Velith Dominion, Do-hyun answered grimly. They have attacked 3 member worlds in the past week, and the Confederacy Defense Fleet attempted to stop them at the Mirax system. Attempted? Sora repeated, noting his choice of words. The fleet was destroyed, Ambassador, and we lost 60% of our combined naval forces in a single engagement. Sora felt her stomach tighten at this news, for she understood what it meant for the galaxy and for the billions of lives now at risk. The Velith Dominion had lurked at the edges of known space for centuries, a predatory empire that consumed weaker civilizations and added their resources to its war machine. The Confederacy had always believed their united strength would deter any aggression, but that belief had just been shattered. The council chamber was the largest enclosed space on the station, a vast circular room where representatives of 47 species gathered to debate and decide the fate of the galaxy. Today, it felt small and suffocating, filled with fear that Sora could almost taste in the recycled air. She took her seat in the human delegation area, a modest section near the outer ring that reflected humanity's status as a relatively new and minor member of the Confederacy. Humans had made first contact only 30 years ago, and in that time, they had established themselves as reliable traders and curious explorers with a small defensive fleet of perhaps 200 patrol vessels. Nothing special, the other species believed, and certainly nothing that would matter in a war of this scale. Elder, Councillor Thaxis of the Rithani stood at the central podium, his forelegs trembling visibly as he addressed the assembly. The Rithani were an ancient species, proud and powerful, and Thaxis himself had spent decades dismissing humans as soft newcomers unworthy of serious consideration. Now, his voice cracked with desperation as he spoke. "Fellow members of the Confederacy, we face extinction," Thaxis declared, his multiple eyes scanning the terrified crowd. "The Volith have broken our primary fleet and now advance unopposed toward the inner systems." Murmurs of fear rippled through the chamber as representatives whispered to one another in dozens of languages. "The Corellian homeworld fell yesterday," Thaxis continued. "Their population of 9 billion now lives under Velith occupation, and we have received reports of mass executions and forced labor camps." A Corellian delegate in the front row made a sound of pure anguish. A keening wail that needed no translation. Sora watched in silence as Thaxis outlined the dire situation. The Confederacy had approximately 300 warships remaining, scattered across dozens of systems and unable to form a cohesive defense. The Velith commanded over 800 vessels, each one crewed by warriors who had known nothing but conquest for generations. The mathematics of the situation were simple and brutal. We must call upon every member world to contribute whatever forces they can spare, Thaxis announced. Every ship, every soldier, every resource must be committed to this fight. His gaze swept across the chamber and eventually settled on the human delegation. "Even our newest members must answer this call," he said with barely concealed condescension. "Whatever small contribution humanity can make will be noted and appreciated." Sora felt the eyes of the entire assembly turn toward her, and she recognized the expectation in their expressions. They wanted her to promise 50 ships, perhaps, or maybe 100 if humanity stretched its resources. They expected a token gesture from a minor species, something symbolic rather than meaningful. She rose slowly from her seat and walked toward the central podium with measured steps. The chamber fell silent as she approached. "For even in crisis there was protocol to observe, Elder Counselor," Sora began, her voice calm and clear. "Humanity has heard your plea and understands the gravity of this situation." Thaxis nodded impatiently, eager to move on to more significant matters. "We are grateful for any assistance Earth can provide," he said dismissively. "How many vessels can you commit to the defense effort?" Sora did not answer immediately, and instead she let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Before I can answer that question," she finally said, "I must request a private communication with my government on Earth." "A communication?" Thaxis repeated with obvious irritation. "Ambassador, we do not have time for bureaucratic delays, and every hour brings the Velith closer to our remaining worlds." "I understand the urgency," Sora replied evenly, "but the decision I must request authorization for cannot be made by an ambassador alone, and I ask the Council to grant me 6 standard hours." Whispers erupted throughout the chamber as representatives debated this unusual request. What decision could possibly require such consultation? They wondered, when humanity's contribution would surely be minimal. Regatal Statius conferred briefly with the other senior counselors before turning back to Sora with a dismissive wave of his upper limbs. "Very well, Ambassador, you have your 6 hours, but do not waste our time with empty gestures." Sora bowed slightly and left the chamber without another word, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. Doshin fell into step beside her as she walked quickly toward the human embassy section of the station. "Ambassador, what are you planning?" he asked quietly. "Our official fleet registry shows only 212 patrol vessels, and even if we committed all of them, it would barely make a difference." Sora stopped walking and turned to face her young assistant with an expression he had never seen before. It was not fear or worry, but something harder and colder. something that reminded him that this woman had served in the United Earth Navy before becoming a diplomat. Da-Yun. What I am about to show you is classified at the highest level, she said softly. You will speak of it to no one until I give you permission. She led him to her private office and activated a secure communication terminal that connected directly to Earth through encrypted channels. The screen flickered to life, and a face appeared that Do-Hyun recognized from news reports and military briefings. Fleet Admiral Park Jun-ho, Supreme Commander of United Earth Naval Forces, looked at them with steady eyes that had seen decades of service. Ambassador Yeon, he said simply, I have been expecting your call, for we have been monitoring the situation since the Mirax engagement. Admiral, the Confederacy is requesting military assistance, Sora reported. They expect us to contribute to our official patrol fleet. Our official fleet, Park repeated, and a thin smile crossed his weathered face. And what do you recommend, Ambassador? Sora took a deep breath before answering, full deployment. Admiral, and it is time. The smile faded from Park's face, replaced by grim determination. Understood, Ambassador. And I will begin activation procedures immediately. Do-Hyun stared at the screen in confusion, for he did not understand the weight of what he was witnessing. Admiral, what does full deployment mean? He asked hesitantly. Park looked at the young man for a long moment before answering. It means, young man, that the galaxy has no idea what they just asked for. And by this time tomorrow, they will learn what humanity has been building in the dark. The transmission ended, and Sora sat down heavily in her chair. Ambassador, please explain what is happening. Do-Hyun pleaded. Sora looked up at him with ancient weariness in her eyes. 30 years ago, when we first made contact with alien life, humanity celebrated our entry into a peaceful galactic community. But our leaders remembered our history, Do-Hyun, and they remembered every war and every genocide, and every time we trusted in peace only to face betrayal. She paused and stared at the blank screen. So while we smiled and traded and explored, we also prepared for the day when smiles would not be enough. And that day has finally come.